As the Second World War cast its dark shadow over Europe, the anticipation of violence and cruelty loomed large in the minds of soldiers and civilians alike. Across the continent, the escalating conflict created an atmosphere of terror, where every passing day brought with it the stark possibility of unimaginable horrors. The brutal tactics employed by the Axis powers, particularly the Nazis, had already established a reputation for mercilessness, leaving both the occupied nations and the Allied forces gripped by a collective sense of dread. The stories of atrocities, of villages being burned to the ground, civilians tortured or executed for the smallest of transgressions, and the systematic destruction of communities, had spread like wildfire, reinforcing the idea that the war would be one of absolute cruelty. As the Allied forces prepared for their inevitable entry into the conflict, the question that haunted them was not whether they could defeat the enemy, but what kind of victory would be possible in such a brutal world. In particular, the British forces, often regarded as the standard-bearers of honor and restraint in warfare, found themselves caught between the harsh realities of total war and the moral obligation to preserve humanity even amidst the devastation. This tension would shape every decision made by the British commanders, who were acutely aware that their actions would not only impact the course of the war but also leave a lasting legacy on the very nature of warfare itself. For the soldiers themselves, the war was no longer just about defeating an enemy, it was about surviving a landscape that had been permanently altered by violence. With every step they took toward the front lines, there was the expectation of brutality, not just from the enemy but from the very environment they were about to enter. The anticipation was palpable, with men preparing themselves for what they had been told was an inevitable experience of cruelty. To fight was to expect nothing but savagery. To survive was to endure the worst that humanity could inflict. As the British forces advanced across the battlefields, the very act of stepping onto enemy soil carried with it the weight of the brutality they knew they might face. The soldiers, trained for years in the art of warfare, had been primed to face a brutal, unforgiving enemy. The words of their commanders echoed in their minds, reinforcing the belief that war was a place where no mercy could be shown, neither to the enemy nor to those caught in between. The Axis powers had set the precedent. In their view, war was a game of total annihilation, where victory was not just about conquering land but about breaking the spirit of the people they sought to control. The relentless bombing campaigns, the occupation of cities, the terror that plagued the populations, these were the harbingers of the kind of war the British soldiers expected to face. Despite these overwhelming fears, there was also an underlying sense of duty that sustained the British forces. They were not entering the war with the same motives as their enemies. The Allied cause was framed not just as a battle for survival, but as a fight for freedom, justice, and the preservation of civilization. This sense of moral superiority became a guiding principle for many, particularly among the British leadership, who were determined to ensure that their conduct in battle would reflect these values. They were not simply another army seeking victory through bloodshed, they were a force seeking to restore order, to reclaim what had been lost, and to show the world that even in the darkest of times, humanity could still prevail. Yet, in the face of such overwhelming violence, this sense of moral purpose was increasingly tested. The brutality of the conflict had a way of grinding down the ideals that many soldiers held dear. There was no escaping the sheer scale of destruction that was unfolding around them. Every city they captured, every battle they fought, seemed to present an opportunity to enact retribution for the wrongs suffered at the hands of the enemy. As the war raged on, it became harder and harder for the British forces to reconcile their lofty ideals with the harsh reality of total war. It was within this context that the British leadership made a decision that would set them apart from many of the other combatants in the war. Unlike the Axis powers, who had embraced a doctrine of total warfare, where the annihilation of the enemy was seen as the only acceptable outcome, the British chose a different path. They decided that even in the face of the most heinous acts of war, they would strive to maintain a sense of restraint. The decision was not an easy one, nor was it one that was universally accepted within the British military. Many saw it as a sign of weakness, a reluctance to fully embrace the brutality of the war. After all, how could an army win a war without resorting to the same ruthless tactics as their enemies? But the British leadership, particularly under the guidance of senior commanders and politicians, recognized that there was more at stake than just military victory. They understood that the outcome of the war would not be determined solely by the number of battles won or the amount of territory captured. The way the British forces conducted themselves, the manner in which they treated both their enemies and the civilian populations caught in the crossfire, would have profound implications for the future of warfare and international relations. To fight a war with restraint, to choose mercy over brutality, was a dangerous gamble. It meant that British forces could not rely on the sheer force of violence to cow their enemies into submission. Instead, they would have to rely on their discipline, their moral clarity, and their ability to hold fast to the principles they believed in, even when those principles seemed to be at odds with the demands of the war. It was a gamble that would cost them dearly in some respects, as they faced down both external enemies and internal critics who questioned their approach. But it was also a decision that would ultimately shape the legacy of the British forces in the war. The first signs of the British restraint became apparent as they began to engage with occupied territories. As the Allied forces advanced into towns and villages, they found themselves confronted with civilians who had endured years of occupation, fear, and oppression. The people were weary, broken by the endless cycle of violence, and yet there was hope in their eyes, hope that perhaps, finally, their suffering was about to end. But even this fragile hope was tempered by the harsh reality that their liberation might come at a cost. The British, in their approach, chose to honor the lives of civilians and spared what they could. Rather than unleashing the kind of devastation that had been inflicted by the Axis forces, the British soldiers showed a surprising level of restraint. When they encountered resistance, their response was not indiscriminate violence, but targeted strikes aimed at minimizing civilian casualties. This was not an easy decision to make. Every day, the soldiers faced the temptation to retaliate with the same ferocity they had witnessed from the enemy. They knew that every victory won through the destruction of enemy forces could have been achieved through ruthless means. But time and again, the British commanders chose restraint. This decision would be remembered not just by those who fought the war, but by the civilians who witnessed it. It was not merely a military strategy. It was a moral stance that, over time, would begin to change the very nature of war itself. The restraint shown by the British forces did not go unnoticed by their enemies. The Axis powers, who had built their military doctrine around the idea of total warfare, could not comprehend this approach. To them, the British were either naive or weak, unable to grasp the true nature of the conflict they were engaged in. But as the war progressed, it became clear that the British forces were not simply fighting a conventional war, they were fighting for something more. In the face of unprecedented violence, they had chosen to hold on to something that many had thought was lost: humanity. It was this moral decision, this willingness to hold fast to restraint when everything around them seemed to demand the opposite, that would come to define the British contribution to the war. The soldiers, who had initially prepared themselves for an all-consuming battle, found themselves engaged in a different kind of struggle, one not just for territory, but for the soul of civilization itself. And as the war raged on, it became clear that the British, by choosing restraint, were not only redefining how wars were fought, they were changing the very essence of what it meant to be victorious in war. As the British forces began to move deeper into enemy-occupied territories, the realities of war took on a new and haunting dimension. The anticipation of cruelty, which had so thoroughly defined their perception of the conflict, now collided head-on with the unexpected experience of restraint. Stepping onto foreign soil, the soldiers could sense the weight of history and suffering that lay in every broken building, every war-torn street. They had been prepared for this moment, but no amount of training could have fully prepared them for the emotional and psychological toll of encountering the devastating aftermath of years of occupation. The civilians they encountered were not the faceless masses of enemies they had imagined, but individuals, families, children, the elderly, who had endured an unimaginable hardship. These were people who had lived under the thumb of foreign oppressors for years, whose every day was marked by the threat of violence, the constant scarcity of resources, and the fear that their very existence might be extinguished with the next raid or attack. To the British soldiers, these civilians were not just victims. They were survivors of a brutal and relentless war machine that had swept across Europe, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. But as much as they were driven by a desire to liberate these people from their tormentors, there was also an unsettling reality they had to face. They were not entering a land that was simply occupied by the enemy. They were entering a land that had been ravaged, scarred, and broken in ways they could hardly begin to comprehend. The British soldiers, fresh from their own battles and having seen the brutality of war firsthand, struggled to reconcile the picture of liberation with the real, complex terrain they now found themselves in. The town squares, once vibrant, were now desolate, with buildings reduced to rubble, streets littered with debris, and the pungent smell of death hanging in the air. As they moved through these shattered communities, the soldiers found themselves confronted by the victims of war, the people who had lost family members, homes, livelihoods, and a sense of security. Yet, amid the devastation, there was something else, something unspoken. The civilians did not react with the fear or animosity the soldiers had braced themselves for. Instead, there was a kind of hollow hope in their eyes, a flicker of something fragile that told the soldiers they might be the ones who could finally end the suffering. But this hope was tempered by a deeper, more complex reality. For the civilians, the British soldiers were not simply liberators. They were yet another force entering their lives, one that would inevitably bring its own brand of destruction and upheaval. Even as the Axis forces had left their mark on the land, so too would the Allied forces. The soldiers knew that, even with their orders to show restraint, the very presence of a foreign military power could change the dynamics of the community forever. The trust they hoped to build with the local population would not come easily, nor would it be unconditional. The British soldiers had become the latest in a long line of occupiers, and the memory of past betrayals and broken promises ran deep within the hearts of those who had lived through years of suffering. As the British soldiers moved further into the towns and villages, they encountered resistance, not just from the enemy, but from the very people they were trying to help. The local resistance groups, weary and distrustful of any outside force, were particularly skeptical of the British. To them, the promise of liberation seemed empty. They had seen too many false promises broken in the past, too many times when foreign powers had come, only to leave when it suited them, leaving the people to fend for themselves. The notion that the British were different, that they would show restraint and respect for the civilians caught in the crossfire, seemed too idealistic to believe. For these partisans, survival was a constant struggle, and trust in the British was not something easily earned. Yet, as the British soldiers continued their advance, they faced a dilemma. The war they were fighting was not just a military campaign, it was a battle for hearts and minds. The notion of restraint, while rooted in morality, was also a pragmatic choice. To win over the local population and to undermine the enemy's support, the British had to demonstrate that their presence would be different, that they were not another army of destruction, but a force that would restore peace and stability. The decision to show restraint was not just about mercy, it was a strategic maneuver, a conscious choice to maintain the moral high ground in a war where the line between right and wrong had already been blurred by years of devastation. This approach, however, was not without its challenges. The British soldiers, many of whom were fresh from the battlefield and hardened by the horrors they had seen, found it difficult to temper their instincts for retribution. Every encounter with the enemy, every skirmish that resulted in loss of life, seemed to demand retaliation. And yet, the British leadership insisted that restraint must remain the guiding principle. The soldiers had been trained for combat, but they had not been trained for the complex moral calculations that came with being both a liberator and a conqueror. The task at hand was not just to defeat the enemy, but to do so in a way that preserved the dignity and lives of those who had already suffered enough. The first major test of this restraint came when the British forces entered a town that had been a stronghold for the Axis powers. The resistance fighters, armed with little more than determination and makeshift weapons, had fought back against the occupying forces in the hope of weakening their hold on the region. In response, the Axis powers had retaliated with overwhelming force, razing much of the town and leaving it in ruins. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces, and the local population, already struggling with the horrors of war, feared that the arrival of British forces would only bring more suffering. As the British soldiers advanced into the town, they faced a choice. Would they respond to the enemy's atrocities with equal force, or would they choose the harder path of restraint? The temptation to retaliate was strong. The town had been decimated by the Axis powers, and the British soldiers knew that the inhabitants had endured unimaginable suffering. Every instinct screamed for vengeance, for an eye response to the devastation that had been wrought. But the orders from their commanders were clear. The British were to show mercy, to limit the destruction, and to protect the civilian population as much as possible. In the face of overwhelming anger and the desire for revenge, the British soldiers chose restraint. They did not raze the town in retaliation. Instead, they carefully targeted enemy positions, limiting the collateral damage to civilians. The decision was a difficult one. Many soldiers wondered if it would even be possible to win the support of the local population with such a measured approach. But as the fighting subsided and the dust settled, the first signs of something unexpected began to emerge. The civilians who had once looked at the British forces with fear and suspicion began to see them not as another occupying force, but as a liberating power, one that would not destroy their homes in the name of vengeance. This was not an immediate transformation. The trust between the British soldiers and the local population was fragile and would take time to build. But the first steps had been taken. The British forces had shown that, even in the midst of war, they were capable of something different, something that the enemy had never offered. They had shown mercy when it would have been far easier to show wrath. And as the weeks passed, the impact of that decision became increasingly clear. The local resistance, once hostile and suspicious of the British, began to reassess their views. They had witnessed firsthand the restraint of the British soldiers, and it was a gesture that resonated with them. The decision not to retaliate, not to lay waste to the town, was a sign that the British were not like the Axis powers. They were not there to break the spirit of the people, but to liberate them. It was a lesson that would take time to absorb, but the seeds of a new kind of alliance were being planted. This would not be an alliance built on fear or coercion, but on respect and trust, and it would change the course of the war in subtle but profound ways. In the days that followed, as the British forces moved into other towns, the pattern of restraint continued. The soldiers, though still battle-hardened and weary, were increasingly aware of the impact of their actions on the people they were trying to liberate. Each decision, each encounter with the local population, was an opportunity to reinforce the principles of mercy and restraint that had been set forth by their commanders. They understood that war was not just about military victory, it was about winning hearts and minds. And in a world where cruelty had become the norm, the British forces' restraint felt like an act of defiance, a refusal to conform to the brutal standards set by their enemies. As British forces continued their advance into the heart of enemy-occupied territories, the reality of restraint began to weigh heavily on the soldiers. It was one thing to make the decision to limit destruction in the heat of battle, but it was another entirely to live with the consequences of that decision on a day-to-day basis. The soldiers had been trained for a war of attrition, a war where the ruthless application of force was often seen as the only way to achieve victory. Now, they were asked to fight a different kind of war, one where victory was not defined solely by the number of enemy soldiers killed or the territory gained, but by the hearts and minds of the people they sought to liberate. At first, the tasks seemed straightforward. The soldiers would liberate towns, fight the enemy, and keep civilian casualties to a minimum. But soon, it became clear that the lines between friend and foe were not as clear-cut as they had imagined. The civilian populations they encountered were not simple victims of an occupying force. They were a complex mix of people, each carrying their own wounds, fears, and allegiances. Some had endured years of oppression under the Axis powers, while others had been forced into collaboration with the enemy in order to survive. The British soldiers found themselves facing not just an external enemy, but the deep moral ambiguity of a population whose suffering had been compounded by years of war and occupation. The British leadership, aware of the fragile nature of this moral battle, sought to instill a sense of discipline and responsibility in their troops. They emphasized that the war was not simply a battle for territory, but a battle for the very soul of Europe, a struggle for the future in which cruelty could not be the guiding principle. But for many of the soldiers, this was an incredibly difficult mindset to adopt, particularly when faced with the very real and present threat of violence from both the enemy and the occupied population. The constant bombardment of propaganda by the Axis powers painted the British as weak and indecisive, reinforcing the idea that the war could only be won through overwhelming force. And yet, time and again, the soldiers were reminded by their commanders that they had been sent not to conquer, but to liberate, and to do so with a restraint that seemed to many like an impractical and naive ideal. This ideal was tested in ways that the British soldiers had not anticipated. As they moved through towns and villages, they found themselves confronted by the stark realities of war. The streets were lined with the remnants of past battles, burned-out buildings, charred vehicles, and the lingering stench of death. The civilian populations, once vibrant and full of life, were now weary and broken. Children played in the streets, but their laughter was hollow, tinged with the trauma of having witnessed atrocities beyond their years. The elderly, who had lived through the horrors of occupation, watched the soldiers with wary eyes, unsure if this new force would bring an end to their suffering or simply continue the cycle of violence. The British soldiers were caught in a difficult position. They were there to liberate, but they were also aware that their presence could create as many problems as it solved. The very nature of occupation was complex, and the relationships between the occupiers and the occupied were fraught with tension. In some areas, the civilians welcomed the British with open arms, overjoyed at the prospect of being freed from the brutality of the Axis forces. In others, however, there was distrust and fear. Many people had already been betrayed by foreign powers who had promised liberation only to leave when it suited them. The civilians of these towns were understandably hesitant to embrace yet another military force, no matter how noble their intentions. Compounding this mistrust was the resistance movement, which had been operating for years under the harshest of conditions. These partisans, often living in hiding and fighting with limited resources, had grown accustomed to operating outside the boundaries of military rules. For them, survival was the highest priority, and the line between right and wrong had often become blurred. Some viewed the British as potential allies in their struggle, while others saw them as just another occupying force. The resistance fighters had fought and bled for years, and they were not about to place their faith in a foreign power that had its own interests at heart. The British forces were well aware of this division, and the leadership made it clear that the success of the campaign would depend not just on military victories but on how well they could engage with the local population. Winning the trust of the civilians was crucial to undermining the enemy's grip on the region. But this task proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The British forces were seen by some as saviors, but by others as just another army marching through their towns. The soldiers, many of whom had come from far-flung corners of the British Empire, were faced with the harsh reality that they were strangers in a foreign land. No matter how noble their cause, their very presence could provoke fear and resistance. It was in this environment that the true nature of British restraint began to emerge. The soldiers, who had been trained to see the enemy as a singular force to be destroyed, now found themselves grappling with a far more nuanced situation. The restraint they were expected to show was not just about minimizing civilian casualties, it was about navigating the delicate balance of respecting the sovereignty and dignity of the people they were trying to free, while also combating an enemy that would stop at nothing to hold on to power. It was a moral tightrope that few had walked before, and it tested the resolve of both the soldiers on the ground and their commanders. In one particularly fraught encounter, a group of British soldiers was ambushed by enemy forces while moving through a small village. The attack resulted in several casualties, and the soldiers, in their anger and frustration, were faced with a decision. The town had been a hotbed of resistance, and there were many who believed that the British should punish the village for its role in aiding the enemy. The temptation to retaliate was overwhelming, yet the orders from above were clear: restraint, mercy, and the protection of civilian lives. The soldiers were torn. They had already seen firsthand the consequences of unchecked cruelty in the war, and they knew that retaliation against the village would only fuel further animosity. The civilians, who had endured years of occupation, would suffer once again. And yet, the need for justice, for retribution against those who had attacked them, was strong. The decision made by the commanders was one that would come to define the campaign. They chose to target the enemy's military positions, leaving the town largely untouched. The decision was not without its consequences. It angered some soldiers, who believed that the village had to be punished for its involvement with the enemy. The partisans, too, were divided. Some believed that the British were showing weakness, while others saw the act as a sign that the British were genuinely different from the enemy. The civilians, for their part, were left to wonder if they had made the right choice in siding with the British. Would they be betrayed as so many others had been in the past, or would this act of mercy truly lead to the liberation they had so long hoped for? Over time, as the British forces continued their advance, the effect of this decision began to ripple outward. The villagers, initially uncertain of the British forces' intentions, began to see them not as conquerors, but as liberators. The restrained actions of the soldiers, while difficult to understand in the moment, were beginning to demonstrate that the British were not simply interested in defeating an enemy, they were interested in preserving the humanity of the people they sought to liberate. This was no easy task. In a war where violence and cruelty had become the norm, restraint was often seen as a liability. Yet, the British were proving that mercy, in the face of overwhelming violence, could be a weapon in its own right. The effect of this approach was not immediate. It took time for the civilians to trust the British soldiers, and even longer for the resistance fighters to accept their presence. But over the course of the campaign, the soldiers began to realize that the war they were fighting was not just against an enemy, but against the very nature of war itself. Every decision to show restraint, to limit destruction, and to protect civilian lives was a decision to fight for a future where the horrors of war would not define the world. It was a decision to fight for something greater than just victory. It was a fight for the preservation of humanity in a time when it seemed to be slipping away. The deeper the British forces moved into occupied Europe, the more evident it became that their strategy of restraint was not just about military success, it was about something far more profound. It was about restoring hope to a broken continent, about proving that even in the darkest times, humanity could endure. The soldiers, who had once anticipated nothing but cruelty with every step, were beginning to realize that the true cost of war was not just in the battles fought, but in the choices made between victory and mercy. And in those choices, they were starting to change everything. As the British forces continued to make their way through occupied territories, the war, which had begun as a fight against a common enemy, soon revealed its more complex and morally ambiguous nature. The British forces found themselves not only engaged in battle against the Axis powers but also grappling with the profound implications of their presence in the region. The concept of restraint, embodied in their mission to liberate, not to conquer, had placed them in a precarious position. Every step forward, every village they liberated, every skirmish they fought, carried not only the potential to shift the course of the war but also to shape the hearts and minds of the people who had endured so much. The question was no longer just about military strategy, but about how they would be remembered. Would they be seen as saviors, as liberators, or simply as another occupying force? The British soldiers quickly realized that their role in the war was far more complicated than they had imagined. They had expected to encounter a straightforward battle with the enemy, but what they faced was a land fractured by years of occupation, where allegiances were fluid and shifting. The civilians they encountered were not simply innocent bystanders. They were people whose lives had been shaped by suffering, fear, and, in many cases, collaboration. Some had been forced to cooperate with the Axis powers in order to survive, while others had resisted at great personal cost. The British soldiers now found themselves in a land where the moral clarity of the conflict was far from obvious. They were not just fighting an external enemy, they were navigating a minefield of historical grievances, local politics, and the fractured identities of the people they sought to help. This situation was compounded by the growing pressure from the resistance groups operating throughout the region. These partisans had been fighting a guerrilla war against the Axis powers for years, living under constant threat of death. Their fight was one of survival, but it was also one of principle. They had fought to preserve the dignity of their people, but in doing so, they had been forced to make difficult choices. The resistance was not a unified force. It was made up of various factions with differing ideologies and goals. Some of these factions viewed the British as potential allies, while others were more skeptical, seeing them as yet another foreign power with its own interests. For the British forces, this created a difficult situation. They were not simply fighting against the Axis. They were also trying to navigate the fractured political landscape that had emerged in the wake of years of occupation. The British soldiers, many of whom were from different parts of the British Empire, were confronted with a moral dilemma at every turn. They were there to liberate, to restore hope to people who had long been oppressed. Yet, they could not escape the harsh reality that their very presence, despite their good intentions, was viewed with suspicion by many. The resistance, in particular, was divided on whether they should fully embrace the British forces as liberators or continue to view them with distrust. The British soldiers were seen by some as allies in the fight against the Axis, while others believed they were simply another army passing through, with no long-term interest in the welfare of the people they were supposed to be liberating. The British leadership had anticipated this challenge and had sought to prepare their soldiers for the complex dynamics they would encounter. The emphasis was always on restraint, on minimizing civilian casualties and avoiding actions that might alienate the local population. The British commanders understood that the true victory in this war would not be measured solely by the number of enemy soldiers killed, but by the way the British forces treated the people they came to liberate. They were determined to avoid the kind of destruction that had characterized the Axis occupation, and to show the world that it was possible to fight a war with humanity. However, the reality on the ground was far more complicated. The soldiers had been trained to engage the enemy in conventional warfare, but what they encountered was a war of ideology, of shifting allegiances, and of profound moral questions. In one particularly challenging situation, the British forces entered a village that had been a stronghold for the resistance. The resistance fighters had been engaged in a prolonged campaign of sabotage and ambushes against the Axis forces, and their actions had made them a target for retribution. The Axis had retaliated against the villagers with brutal force, executing suspected collaborators and destroying homes. The British forces, upon entering the village, found it in ruins, its streets littered with rubble, its people broken. The civilians, many of whom had been caught between the competing forces of the Axis and the resistance, were wary of the British soldiers. They had been betrayed before, and they had learned not to trust outsiders. The British soldiers, despite the anger they felt at the suffering of the people, were ordered to show restraint. Their mission was not to punish the villagers for their past actions, but to liberate them from the clutches of the Axis. This was a difficult decision for the soldiers, many of whom had lost comrades in the fight against the enemy. They wanted justice, but they also understood the importance of maintaining the moral high ground. The British forces could not afford to become like the enemy they were fighting. They could not let vengeance define their actions. The decision was made to target the enemy's military positions while minimizing the destruction of civilian infrastructure. The British forces avoided indiscriminate bombing and instead conducted a precise operation aimed at weakening the Axis's hold on the village without further harming the population. The result was a mixed reaction from the villagers. Some were grateful for the British intervention, seeing it as a sign that their suffering was finally coming to an end. Others, however, remained suspicious. They had been betrayed too many times by foreign powers to place their trust in the British. The resistance fighters, too, were divided. Some saw the British action as a necessary step in the liberation process, while others viewed it as a missed opportunity to strike a blow against the occupying forces. The British soldiers, for their part, struggled with the consequences of their actions. The restraint they had shown was not popular among all of their comrades, some of whom believed that a stronger response was needed to assert control over the region. The soldiers were increasingly aware that the war they were fighting was not just about military victories, it was about making choices that would determine the kind of world that would emerge after the conflict. They understood that every decision they made would leave a mark on the future, and they were determined to make the right choices, even when it was difficult. The tension between restraint and retribution continued to grow as the British forces moved deeper into enemy-occupied territories. The more they encountered the suffering of the civilian population, the more it became apparent that their mission was not just a military campaign, it was a moral struggle. The question was no longer simply about defeating the enemy, it was about how to engage with the people they sought to free. The war, once a simple matter of military strategy, had become a battle for hearts and minds, a struggle for the soul of Europe. The British forces faced increasing pressure from various quarters to take a more aggressive approach. The resistance fighters, despite their internal divisions, called for stronger actions to be taken against the Axis powers. They saw the British forces as their allies in the struggle for freedom, but they also believed that the British had the power to end the war more quickly if they were willing to fight with greater intensity. The civilian population, too, was divided. Some saw the British as their liberators, but others were afraid of the consequences of their presence. The British were not the only force operating in the region. The Axis powers, the resistance, and even other allied factions all had their own interests at heart. The civilians were caught in the middle, struggling to survive in a war that had torn their world apart.